Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, November 30th. We are studying Talmud, and we have a special session today with a special guest, Rabbi Jeff Mitelman of Sinai and Synapses, the organization about which he will describe in his own words and tell you about his work and his vision, and also about the special course that he'll be teaching here over Zoom for our WRT community, and of course, friends and guests always welcome, beginning next month, beginning in January. I'm thinking that it's already December. So please join me in a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So what I'd like to do actually is spotlight both myself and Rabbi Mitelman. So there we go. So now you should be able to see both of us side by side. Morning, Jeff. I didn't dress for you. I dressed for a funeral.
Okay, that's how you dress.
Yeah, no. The attire for our class is decidedly casual. I won't say who, but I've definitely seen people come to this class in their PJs. So it's comfort is encouraged as long as your brain is dressed and ready to go. You're good to go. So
I have my coffee, so I'm good.
Rather than do this in keeping with the informal vibe here, I've known you, Jeff, since I came to Westchester. So when I came to Westchester to become the associate rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple, the year was 2003, and I think you had a few years earlier begun serving as the assistant and then the associate rabbi of Temple Bethel of Northern Westchester in Chappaqua, with then senior rabbi Josh Davidson, husband of our own cantor Mia Fram Davidson. I don't have the exact timeline, but is that right?
It was. So I grew up in Westchester. I grew up at Woodlands Community Temple, which is not so far. It used to be actually a very Scarsdale-oriented synagogue. Now it's more Rivertowns. And then I was actually ordained in 2007 and came back to Westchester. I was also ordained out of Cincinnati. You were in Cincinnati as well, if I remember.
But we never crossed paths because I was ordained in 2000.
Okay, yeah. So I was ordained in 2007, but I was back in Westchester a lot. And so we worked together definitely when I went back to Bethel, and grew up in Briarcliff. In my where I worked was at Bethel and Chappaqua, and so I always say that I'm from Westchester because I'm connected to so many different Westchester areas as well.
I'd love, Jeff, for you to tell a little bit of your story and what you do and how it informed your approach to Torah. I've spoken with you at length. We're friends. I've also had you podcasting with me, and I know that your story traverses through the long road of mathematics studies at Princeton University and eventually makes its way to the Reform Rabbinate. And from there, you've gone on to do really interesting, and I don't use this word lightly, but you do unique work. Jeff operates uniquely as a Reform rabbi at the intersection of science and spirituality. You're the only rabbi I know who does precisely what you do. And so maybe you could share a little bit of your story, what you do, how it informs your approach to Torah, and maybe some of your hopes for what we're going to learn today and what we're going to learn in January.
Sure. Thank you. It's nice to see you all. I see a lot of familiar names and faces and some people that I will be getting to know over the next couple of weeks. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here with all of you this morning. So as Jonathan mentioned, I grew up, we've known each other, and I grew up in Westchester. And when I was born, my father was the president of Woodlands Community Temple. So I literally grew up in the synagogue. I think I started to walk in the sanctuary at Woodlands Community Temple, and always loved science and math on one side and Judaism on the other, and always sort of thought about them a little bit separately. But I always enjoyed looking at both of these different kinds of questions. And as I went into rabbinical school, I grew up, I'm probably a little bit younger than you, but not hugely. I grew up in my high school years were in the 90s. And in the 90s, in a lot of ways, was when a lot of the public discourse kind of started to deteriorate. And a lot of the conversations that people used to have on complicated, difficult issues, it used to be that I could say, questions of, oh, I didn't know that's what you were thinking about. Tell me a little bit more about where you are. And then it became, no, I'm right. And then it became, no, I'm right, you're wrong. And then it became, I'm right, you're stupid. And now it's a question of, I'm right, you're evil. And I think that's where a lot of our conversation is. And the questions of science and religion fit into that dichotomy, where there's a perspective in America right now where there's two sides. One side is viewed as scientific and educated and liberal, and the other side is viewed as religious and uneducated and conservative. And there's a belief that if you pick anything from either of those columns, you've got to pick everything in that column. And it's better to be able to demonize the other side than to actually engage in these kinds of conversations and to say, you know what, there's wisdom from multiple different perspectives. So I started to look at these questions of science and Judaism as thinking about, how do we have a better conversations about science and religion? How do we approach these questions from, we can approach these questions in different ways of thinking. But the questions that we're grappling with really are human questions. Who am I? How do I act in this world? How do I relate to others? What's my responsibility to society? And we look at these questions not from, at least for me, not so much from a top-down perspective, but from a bottom-up perspective. Trying to say, what are the core big questions that we're looking at? Where does Torah and Judaism have some wisdom to say about these questions? Where does science have to say about some of these questions? We're going to talk today about miracles, because that's a wonderful thing to look at, of the science of miracles, and it's going to be a little bit different than where we might think. I know, Jonathan, you're going to talk a little bit about the miracle of Hanukkah. But a lot of the way that I approach these questions is saying, what are the core questions that we need to look at, and to be able to say, everybody comes at these questions, whether that's us, whether that's the scientists that we're looking at, whether that's the religious authors that we're looking at, whether it's people we agree with or disagree with. Everybody comes at a question saying, I think I am right. I think I have some value. I think I am going to bring something to the table here, even if I disagree with it, because nobody says, I know I'm going to say something that is going to be stupid and destructive and make the world worse. Nobody says that on purpose. Everybody always says, I think I have something to say. And so trying to be able to say, well, what is that you're trying to say? Where are you trying to bring some of the value into this conversation? So that's how I tend to approach questions of science and Judaism and questions of Torah, even if it makes us a little bit uncomfortable, trying to be able to look at this from a perspective of, what are the core human questions that we're going to be exploring?
Thank you so much. Well, we're excited to learn with you, beginning today, and then picking up with exciting material of a theme that is not related to today's study, but that all coheres around the idea of how Judaism is grappling with already, and will be forced to reckon with, a number of developments that you'll read about mostly through a scientific lens, but ought to be brought into the synagogue, really ought to be brought into Jewish inquiry. And I think that's what will make the study that you're leading beginning in January so exciting for our community, and so apt, especially for an already built community of serious learners, that is to say, all of you here today who've been attending our study for so long, and also any guests who've just dropped in. We have a really nice group today. We have over 30 here in the Zoom room. I'm delighted. So today is a little bit of a Vorspeise, a little bit of an appetizer portion of Hanukkah cheer, which I will acknowledge is an intentional detour from the very difficult contemplations that we've been engaging with over the last 7.5 weeks since the attacks of October 7th. All of the Talmud we've been studying since then has been directed toward exploring questions and themes that emerge almost naturally from the discourse around the war, and have touched on how the Jewish tradition, with a focus on Gemara, with a focus on Talmud, views the mitzvah of Pidyon Shivuyim, the redemption of captives, the ethics of war, and even the project of Zionism itself have all been part of what we've been exploring since October 7th. Today, we're taking a pre-Hanukkah detour so that when you gather around your Chanukiot, your Hanukkah menorahs, with people you love, with family, with friends, to perform the mitzvah and maybe spin a dreidel, eat some fried foods, and play some games and share gifts. You'll also be able to share the gift of your learning. And you can say to your kids or grandkids, did you know that, okay, and the did you know is about to happen right now. So what I'm going to do is go back to the usual screen view here so that you should see whoever is speaking. And I know, Rabbi Mitelman, you are a very seasoned practitioner on Zoom. We would expect nothing less from somebody who operates directs an organization called Sinai and Synapses, that you would know a thing or two about how to teach over Zoom. So all of our students are pretty well seasoned at this point. They know to use the chat box, the digital hand raise feature, how to mute and unmute themselves, though sometimes I have to be the reminder. So we've already said a bracha. Let's dive right in. The passage that we're going to examine right off the top here is Bavli, so the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, page 21b. I've called it up, and I realized just this week that I can reformat the way in which the Hebrew and the English present themselves. So instead of doing up-down, top-bottom, I've presented the Hebrew side by side. That if you are becoming a more seasoned Sefaria user, the way you do that is through this feature up here. First of all, you can bookmark. If you want to return to a text, you just hit the bookmark function, but I'm not signed in right now. And this little capital letter A, gives me my menu of how I'd like to display the text. So you can display it in just English, or you can display it in just Hebrew or Hebrew English. And then for Hebrew English, you can choose top, bottom, side by side, or inverted side by side. And you can even increase the font size. So I'm doing large font, side by side Hebrew English. You can probably see just from the conversation that's taking place, and we're picking up the conversation in this section of Talmud midstream, that we're talking about kindling light. And you may say, how come the mitzvah of Hanukkah and Hanukkah lights is included in Tractate Shabbat? Well, the simplest answer is we don't have an independent Tractate Hanukkah. The second answer is that in the usual, almost free associative manner in which the Talmud is compiled, composed, and presented, discourse often seems to follow side paths and rabbit holes. And this one's actually not too deep a rabbit hole. There is, I think all of us would admit, a fairly logical extension from talking about kindling Shabbat lights to kindling Hanukkah lights, right? The signature mitzvah of observing Hanukkah is to kindle a Chanukiah, a specific candelabrum or lamp that includes 9 candles, one for each of the days of Hanukkah, plus a shamash or shamas candle, which is the helper candle, the candle that kindles the other lights. That, though, is where the direct similarity between kindling Shabbos lights and kindling Hanukkah lights ends. There are actually a lot of differences between a Shabbat candle and a Hanukkah candle. And some of you even know this from the quality of the candles that you buy for both holidays. No diss to Eve, who's with us today. I just bought my Hanukkah menorah lights, my candles. You can buy them in our Judaica shop at the temple. There's a beautiful selection. You can get all white, blue and white, or rainbow. And I think they're $15 a box, and that's because they're really good candles. You get 44 Hanukkah candles in a box, which is what you need for all 8 nights of Hanukkah. Now, having said that, how many of you have ever noticed that the quality of your Hanukkah candles is, let us say, inferior to those of any other candles you would use for any other purpose? Right. It's the opposite of a Shabbat candle in some ways. The Hanukkah candles tend to burn down very fast. They melt, they smoke a lot, and they're not made of very high quality materials typically. And that actually is in part because of the way in which the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles differs from the mitzvah of lighting Shabbat candles, right? The point of a Shabbat candle is actually utilitarian light. The reason that it's a Shabbat candle, and yes, we ritualize the blessing, we make the kindling of light the official marker point for the onset of Shabbat, the beginning of the Shabbat observance. But the real reason that a Shabbat light is made out of a durable candle is because making fire is one of the 39 restricted categories of work on the Sabbath. So once your Shabbat candles are lit, if they go out, if they're extinguished, you can't relight them because then you're violating the Sabbath. And the custom, of course, comes from a time and milieu where candlelight was utilitarian light. So the whole point of a Shabbat candle was, this is the light, you have to kindle all the candles in your house before the sun sets, before you say the bracha. By the way, it's also the only mitzvah that is performed where you do the activity and then say the mitzvah. So the proper way to light Shabbat candles is you light the candle and then say, Baruch atah Adonai, etc., lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Most or all, I think, other mitzvot, you actually say the bracha and then perform the mitzvah. Putting up a mezuzah, for instance, wearing a talit, for instance. You say, Baruch atah Adonai, likboa mezuzah, clink, and the mezuzah goes up. Or, lehita teif batzitzit, and the talit goes over the shoulders. With the Shabbat lights, you light and then you bless. And that's because the blessing effectuates the condition. Right? So the blessing is what actually makes it Shabbat. The minute you say lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, it's Shabbat, and therefore you can't kindle light afterward. Now, Hanukkah lights are different. Hanukkah lights are actually ner shel mitzvah. The only purpose a Hanukkah light has is to fulfill a mitzvah. It is strictly not utilitarian. In fact, you can't read by Hanukkah light. I mean, you can, but you may not. You are not permitted Jewishly to use the Hanukkah lights for any purpose other than publicizing the miracle of Hanukkah to the world, which is why the Chanukiah goes in the window. And we could talk more about that in light of the war and people's complex feelings about advertising their Jewishness in a world where to do so may invite danger. That's a side conversation that's relevant, and if we have time, we might get to it. So I wanted to just begin by acknowledging that Tractate Shabbat is where you find the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah lights, and Daf 21b, page 21b, is where it's all described. So that's where we find ourselves today. And so I just want to observe, we're not going to actually read this. They're talking about the difference between the kind of wicks you can use on Shabbat and Hanukkah, and what do you do, for instance, if your light goes out, or if you have to adjust the wick. And you can see that Steinsaltz has even said, even on Shabbat, there is no concern about adjusting the wick, because it is prohibited to utilize its light. Okay, so this is a rabbinic argument over the ins and outs of lighting candles. Okay, with regard to the opinion that one need not rekindle the Hanukkah light if it is extinguished, the Gemara asks, and is it true that if the Hanukkah light is extinguished, one is not bound to attend to it? The Gemara raises a contradiction from that which was taught in the Baraita. The mitzvah of kindling the Hanukkah lights goes from sunset until traffic in the marketplace ceases. So it's very different from Shabbat. The whole idea is not to have the lights burning for 24 hours, right? The idea is just from nightfall until people get home, which is why Hanukkah candles burn down so fast, right? You're following. Then you get into the famous argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel on how to light your Chanukiah. This will probably be familiar to many of you. Beit Shammai says on the first day, one kindles 8 lights, and from there on gradually decreases the number of lights until on the last day of Hanukkah, he kindles 1 light. Now, everyone knows that Shammai is wrong, which is why his name does not end up on college campuses. His rival, Intellectually only. Jeff made a very important point. Hillel and Shammai exemplify the kind of argument where it's not you're wrong or you're stupid or you're evil. It's just, no, I disagree with you, and here's my principled reason for my disagreement. And back and forth it goes. Hillel and Shammai exemplify what in the Jewish tradition is called machloket l'shem shamayim. Idiomatically, a dispute for a holy purpose. Literally, an argument for the sake of heaven. In other words, we Jews believe that debate, discourse, and yes, disagreement, dispute, all can serve a higher and holy purpose. I would live and die by that conviction. But unfortunately, as Jeff said, the state of discourse today is more frequently toxic. And anyone who engages with social media on a regular basis has probably felt the need to take a shower afterward because of the toxicity of that environment. So Beit Hillel, without dissing his opponent in any insulting way, simply says, on the first day, one kindles one light, and from there on gradually increases the number of lights until on the last day kindles 8 lights. And of course, Hillel wins. Now, there is something to be said for the logic of the Shammai argument, right? If you know the story of Hanukkah, it would be logical to say that, well, you had the most oil, the most fuel light on the first day of the festival, and then it diminishes. Right? You just burn down and burn down and burn down until at the end you're left with nothing. Hillel's argument does not prevail because it is more logical. It prevails because it's more Jewish, as it were. So does anyone know, it's in the next sugya, it's in the very next section, but what is Hillel's reasoning for saying, no, you start with one light and you grow the light so that on the 8th day you have 8 lights? I've given you a little clue. It's not going to be something that appeals to your logic. Yeah, Aaron.
Doesn't he argue we should be bringing more light into the world as time goes on?
Yeah, and he uses, that's great, perfect. And he uses this language to say exactly that. So he says, let's see. Okay, so this is where further sages, Amoraim, we're talking many centuries after Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai presided over their academies, it is assumed, during the 1st century before the Common Era. That in part is why they are never properly called rabbi. So if anyone ever says Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai, you can actually say, actually, they weren't ordained rabbis, at least not the way the Jewish tradition recognizes them. They don't have those titles. They're just Hillel and Shammai, or Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, meaning the academies of Hillel and Shammai, respectively. So Amoraim is, as many of us remember from our study, the latter, or the kind of like middle stratum of Talmudic commentators, the discussers. You have the Tanaim, who are the earliest reciters of the tradition, whose recorded words are in the Mishnah, and in the extra Mishnaic but contemporaneous literature like the Baraitas, and the Baraita and the Tosefta. And then the subsequent, chronologically speaking, class of commentators are the Amoraim, the discussers, say 300 to 500 or 600 of the Common Era. And then after the Amoraim, you have the Savoraim, who are the kind of like the final reasoners and compilers of the Talmudic literature. All of this is very rough and highly speculative, by the way, but it's a general way of understanding the general or relative time frame of these speakers. So Ulla said there were 2 Amoraim in the West, meaning Eretz Yisrael, right? Why would that be the West? Because it's the Babylonian Talmud. The Amoraim are definitively writing from Babylonia. So the West would be Yisrael relative to Babylonia, which is today Iraq. Who disagreed with regard to this dispute, meaning they're arguing over what this is really all about. Rabbi Yossi bar Avin and Rabbi Yossi bar Zavida. One said that the reason for Beit Shammai's opinion is that the number of lights corresponds to the incoming days, that is to say, the future, right? If on night 1 of Hanukkah you have 8 lights, it refers to the days ahead of you. On the first day, 8 days remain in Hanukkah, one kindles 8 lights, and on the second day, 7 day remains, etc. The reason for Beit Hillel's opinion is that the number of lights corresponds to the outgoing day. So that's a logical argument, but it's not the one Aaron mentioned, and therefore it's not the one that gets remembered. Each day, the number of lights corresponds to the number of days of Hanukkah that were already observed, elapsed days. The other rabbi, the one who I think makes the more compelling point, not this one, but when he gets to Hillel. One said that the reason for Beit Shammai's opinion is that the number of lights corresponds to the number of bulls of the festival of Sukkot. I wanted to bring this because a lot of you are raising eyebrows going, well, what the hell does that have to do with anything? And the answer is actually more than you think. 13 bulls were sacrificed on the first day, and each succeeding day, one fewer was sacrificed according to the book of Numbers. We'll get back to that. Why are we referencing Sukkot sacrifices in reference to the Hanukkah lights? The reason for Beit Hillel's opinion is that the number of lights is based on the principle. That's why I say it's a principle. It's a theological principle or a Jewish principle more than it's a logic point. One elevates to a higher level in matters of sanctity, and one does not downgrade. It's terrible in English. It's so good in Hebrew. So it says, Amar Tama de Beit Shammai keneged Perei Chag, which means it corresponds to the bulls of the festival of Sukkot. The Tama de Beit Hillel, the reason for Hillel's point is Dima'alin bakodesh ve'ein moridin. This is actually a celebrated line in Talmudic literature and in Jewish life. Dima'alin bakodesh, one ma'alin, like aliyah, one goes up in matters of kedusha, holiness, kodesh, ve'ein, but does not moridin, go down. So when it comes to doing a mitzvah, when it comes to something that's going to bring holiness, or Aaron's use of the word light here is, of course, metaphorical, spiritual light, mitzvah light, one always seeks to increase, never diminish, right? So if you have a baseline of mitzvah performance in your life, the Jewish goal would be to aspire yet higher and higher and higher. Never to assume that the level of mitzvot that you are or one is performing today is at the peak and then it will diminish over time. And anyone in this class is actually living proof of that, because I'm willing to bet that for many, many, many years in your life, maybe even many decades, you were not devoted to weekly study of Talmud, and now you are. So whenever you join this class, you took on a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, of studying Torah, of studying Jewish tradition, and you've been elevating it. And I hope that that's something that will continue in your life, and that you'll come to realize that, wow, I can't live without this. What more can I do that's Jewish? Okay, so ma'alin bakodesh ve'ein moridin. You go up in matters of holiness, you don't go down. That's the Hillelian principle. Now's where we start to get to the good stuff for today. Well, this is good stuff, right? Okay. I'm gonna close this little sidebar. It's annoying me. Okay, thank you. Okay, so proceeding through Shabbat 21b. Okay, I want to come back to bulls of the festival for just a minute before we get to the other mitzvot and finally get to miracles, which will be my point for handing off to my colleague. So Jewish history here, not Jewish legend. And we're going to need today to do some mental recategorizing of how we understand Hanukkah. In strictly historical terms, what does Hanukkah commemorate? Not a rhetorical question. This is definitely a test your Jewish knowledge moment, but please don't be bashful, because I'm going to assume that a lot of you know the answer to this. Okay, Mom and Dad, you're on.
Rededication of the temple.
Great. Hanukkah means dedication, or in this case, rededication of the temple. Good. Let's do a little bit of who, what, when, where, and why. So who is responsible for rededicating the temple, again, in Jewish history? You want to stay, Dad? We can make this like
okay, the Maccabees.
Father-son trivia here. You can just stay on the Zoom. See how much you know.
Okay. Mattathias, the Maccabees.
Right. Okay. So
guerrilla zealots.
This clan of zealous priestly Jews that we colloquially call the Maccabees, family name Hashmonai, often called the Hasmoneans. It's exactly the same. Kids all call them the Maccabees. Scholars call them the Hasmoneans. It's the same. Mattathias, the head of the clan, the father of the clan, the lead was actually his son Judah Maccabee. I'm very excited, actually. I met with a wedding couple whose wedding I'm officiating this spring. The bride grew up at WRT, but she met this wonderful groom who I was meeting for the first time. Her fiance is Dan Maccabee. I'm like, you've got a great name next week. Like, that's his real name. So I think she's going to take his surname, and they will be the Maccabees. Okay, so that's the who. Why did they have to rededicate the temple?
Because it was overrun by the Assyrians.
Right, overrun by the puppet empire in Syria, which was part of the Hellenistic civilization, the Greeks, who set up little states in various regions that had been conquered as part of Alexander's conquest beginning in the 3rd century BCE, including the territory that we call Eretz Yisrael, but also the northern kingdom, which is today Syria, and the southern kingdom, which was and still is Egypt. The Greeks set up a puppet state in Egypt called the Ptolemaic Empire, with a PT like pterodactyl. The Ptolemies were actually, they dressed them up and made false claims that they were directly descended from the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. They weren't. They were Greek puppet rulers, but they kind of preserved Egyptian culture for the sake of, I guess, ruling the masses in their autocratic way. And then the kingdom that was set up in what is today Syria. Does anyone know the name of the northern kingdom?
Seleucid.
The Seleucid Empire, exactly. Seleucid. So the Seleucids, that was Norm, right? Norm's
Yes.
our history maven. Good job. And of course, the baddest of all the Seleucid kings was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was the name by which he was known. And he was particularly antagonistic toward the Jews, and participated and led what was commonplace for the Hellenistic empire at the time, which was to take their subjugated peoples and subject them to a fairly comprehensive program of Hellenization, making them like the Greeks. I think the idea was, these are backwater people with primitive ways, and their religion is not like our enlightened culture. And so, the legends and lore from the time suggest that Jews were restricted from taking traditional Hebrew names and were encouraged to take Greek names, and that Jews were, basically either discouraged or denied the opportunity to participate in traditional Torah education and were subjected to Hellenistic education, traditional, we would call it secular education, that they were, at some point, even more rigorous restrictions were placed upon the community, such as restricting things like traditional dress, traditional styles of hair, even circumcision, and eventually the outlawing of the ordination of, well, it wasn't the ordination of rabbis, but the kind of, the promulgation of Jewish law and Jewish teaching and training people in the Jewish way. All of this is what is at least traditionally associated with the rule of the Greeks. Whether or not all of this is really true, we will probably never know, because the people who write about it are not reliably historians. They're as much storytellers who evince a kind of Jewish bias in the way they tell the story. Okay, so Antiochus has been aggravating the Jews for a long time in the course of routine military skirmishes. For instance, with Egypt, his armies decide that they need more money, so they raid the treasury of the temple. You can imagine this does not go over well with the Jewish loyalists, and in particular, these very zealous Hasmoneans or Maccabees, who decide that they're going to take up arms and develop a kind of guerrilla approach to waging war against Antiochus and his much larger, more powerful army. And I think you know how the story goes. They hide out in caves, but the temple falls into the hands of Antiochus's forces. And eventually, the Maccabees do reclaim it. When do they reclaim the temple? What time of year? This is an easy question, by the way.
Now,
Now, right.
Sometime
Right?
now.
Hanukkah begins a week from today. So the 25th of Kislev. That's when. So where were the Jews on Sukkot the year that the Maccabees redeemed the temple from the hands of the foe?
They were fighting.
They were, what'd you say, Barbara?
They were fighting.
They were fighting, right?
They were
And
fighting.
so the story is that they're hanging out in the caves. They do not have possession of their shrine. Sukkot is the holiday that requires more sacrifices and offerings at the temple than any other holiday.
And the prayer for
Therefore,
rain.
Right.
And the prayer
It's
for rain.
also their petitions for rain, right? All of this is what Sukkot is all about. Now, when the Maccabees defeat the foe and take the temple back and rededicate it, the first thing they did was turn on the lights. They kindled the Chanukiah. It wasn't a Chanukiah. They kindled the menorah in the temple, 7 branches, right? Because it's dark. And the first declaration that they make is that we should celebrate Sukkot now because we didn't have the opportunity 2 months ago. And so they declare Sukkot Kislev, Sukkot in December, which is later institutionalized as kind of second Sukkot, aka Hanukkah. That's why we have an 8-day festival, historically speaking. And I don't have the time right now to show you all the texts that prove my point, but take it on faith from your rabbi. This is the real reason that we have an 8-day festival in Kislev. Okay, now back to the Gemara. That, however, is not the story that the Gemara wants to tell us about what Hanukkah means. All right, so hang on, I need to call up my tab. Okay. All right, then they get, okay, here it is. Here's the passage. I skipped over the part about why we put the Chanukiah in the window. Okay, the Gemara asks, my Chanukah. I don't know if you can see it, but here in the Aramaic, my Chanukah. What is Hanukkah? What's the deal? What is this festival? The Tanu Rabbanan. So the rabbis taught, and the word again, Tanu, is always an indicator that this comes from in one of the earlier strata, like the Mishnaic period. The Tanu Rabbanan, but Kaf He, the Kislev. Kaf He is simply 25. Kaf is the 20th letter of the Aleph Bet. He is the 5th. Kaf He with a little triptych, a little quotation mark in the middle, means 25. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, Yomei de Chanukah, Timanya Inun, which means Yomei, this is Aramaic. Yomei de Chanukah means the days of Hanukkah. Timanya is the Aramaic form of Shmoneh, which is Hebrew for 8, right? 8. Inon, there are. So on the 25th of Kislev, there are 8 days of Hanukkah. On the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. Inon. Dela lemispad behon, udela lehit anot behon. So again, Aramaic, dela means shelo, so that you cannot lemispad behon. That means you can't eulogize. In other words, you're not supposed to do public mourning on those days. Lehit anot behon. This is the same root as what you do on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. You can't engage in public acts of self-deprivation or private acts. You can't deprive yourself traditionally through fasting, but it also would include the other restricted, pleasurable activities on the fast days. All right, so Hanukkah, in other words, is happy time. You can't do the sad things on Hanukkah. Goes on to say, Shekisha nichnesu, we're back to Hebrew, Yivanim lahechal. So when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, when the Greeks entered the temple, Timeu kol hashemanim shebachechal, they defiled all of the oil that was in the sanctuary. How did they defile it? Presumably just by touching it, just by being Greek and handling something that was sacred, because the oil was used for purposes of kindling sacred light. Again, remember, this is tied into a whole longer context about kindling Shabbat light and the difference between sacred light and utilitarian light. So the Greeks handling this oil desecrated the oil, defiled it. So they found that the Greeks had defiled the oil. And when the Hasmonean, it calls it a monarchy, it does become a dynasty, but really at the time it's just a militia. When the Hasmonean militia overcame the Greeks, the nitchum, this is a really good word. Right now, the slogan of Israel is, I'm blanking. Is it?
I think it's Anachnu Netzach, or it's Netzachu, I think it's right.
Yeah, it uses the same word, Anachnu Yinatzachu, or something like that, or Ninatz, or Yinatzeach, or I think it's Yachad Yinatzeach. Together we will prevail. The word Yinatzeach is the future tense of the word Netzach, which means to be victorious. So together we will prevail. It's like everywhere in Israel right now. It's on every billboard, bumper stickers, flags, signs, schools, government buildings. Yachad Yinatzeach. I'll double check that, but I definitely know that the same word is here. We will prevail. So when the Maccabees prevailed, Badku velo matzu ele pach echad, they looked around, they checked, and found only a single vial, shel shemen, of oil, shaya munach bechotamo, which was marked with placed with the seal, S-E-A-L, shel kohen gadol, of the high priest. So they found one cruse of holy oil that was marked, for specific use by the kohen gadol. V'lo haya bo ela lahadlik yom echad, and there was enough in it only to light for one day, yom echad, one day. Na'asa bo nes, and yet a miracle was wrought through it, meaning through the oil. Na'asa bo nes, a miracle happened in it, meaning with the oil. V'idliku mimenu shmona yamim, and they were able to kindle with it, the oil, 8 days. Lishana acheret kiva'um. The next year, or in another year, they established this custom, these 8 days. It's in the plural, so it means they fixed them. Va'asa'um yamim tovim, and they made them into Yom Tov. They made them into Yantif, right? They made them into an actual holiday, B'halel v'hoda'ah, for praise and thanksgiving. All right. Well, there's a lot going on in this passage, but there's also, I think, for our purposes, for our reading, a lot not going on in this passage, right? This is definitively about something that we've never heard before in Jewish history. And most scholars agree that this is the first and really the only time up until now that the rabbis have talked about a miracle of Hanukkah. And because the passage is what it is, the absolute earliest that this passage is probably 3rd, 4th century, though many date the passage to much later, 5th, 6th, even 7th century. In other words, if the Maccabean victory took place, and we know it did, in the first quarter of the 2nd century BCE, so around the 170s, I think 175, 178. This is knowable stuff, by the way. It's one of the more reliable dates in ancient Jewish history is the Maccabean uprising, because there is ample textual evidence, not only from Jewish text, but also from other texts and archaeology from that period. Substantial archaeology from the Hasmonean period, because it's in a tradition that's more than 3,000 years old. something that's only 21 or 2200 years old is relatively recent. The Talmud is introducing 500 years, 600 years post facto, a new narrative about this holiday. And it says this is not actually a story of a military victory. It's a story of a miracle. So, and somebody just in layman's terms, what makes it a miracle? Yeah, Barbara.
If, because we were already scattered throughout the world, if we lived in other places under different circumstances with different kings and rulers and laws and everything, if they would have celebrated a military victory, as Hanukkah was, their lives would have been in danger.
Okay, so one, yeah, I think that you're going actually even deeper than the question I asked, which I appreciate. I mean, in simplest terms, it's a miracle because the divine hand made possible something that should not be possible, right? But even with that, why not say, well, because God is God and because God can do things that people cannot do, a small band of country priests who took up arms against a much mightier and vaster army prevailed and was victorious. That's not what it says. It says after the Maccabees were victorious, almost as if that's like an afterthought. It's not the relevant point is that they prevailed. And it uses the word they were victorious, but that has nothing to do with God in this passage. God's hand is seen in the fact that the oil had been ritually defiled. They found one pure cruse of oil with the seal of the high priest on it, meaning untouched, untarnished by the Greeks, but it only had enough oil for one day. A miracle was wrought through it. Very interesting use of the passive voice here. It doesn't actually say God worked a miracle. It says na'asa bo nes, which is, I think, in very intentional writing. It leaves open how the miracle happened, who caused the miracle. It just says a miracle was wrought through this oil. But we already know that the oil is special. It's marked with the seal of the high priest. It has religious significance. And that oil allowed a miracle to happen so that the oil lasted for 8 days. And that's the miracle, not the military victory. Then we get to the deeper layer, I think the really important layer that Barbara has so eloquently taught, which is that some of this may have to do with what it meant to be a rabbi in a Jewish community writing in Babylonian exile in the 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th century of the Common Era, where extolling the military might of a guerrilla band of Jewish priests who took matters into their own hands, took up arms, and basically, didn't just bloody the nose, but actually defeated the imperial power of the day. Maybe not such a great message for an exiled band of Jews who want to curry favor, or at least not make waves with the empire, right? And this is a long story of what it means to be a Jew in diaspora. I hope many of you will still choose to come tonight. I know it's a $36 fee. It's worth every penny to hear Liel Leibowitz, the author and journalist, writes for Tablet Magazine. He wrote the newest Jewish encyclopedia, which is just great. And he's written a new book on his journey into the study of Talmud. And he's speaking at WRT tonight at 7 o'clock. It's a program sponsored by Freebirds, open to all. You can register online. I'm going to be having a discussion with Liel about his book, but I think that really this is one of the things he talks about in the book is how the Talmud is a book by and for a broken people. It is not a book by and for a people of sovereignty, a people of military capacity. It's by and for an exilic community. So, okay, so we've toiled in the vineyard of the Hanukkah story for the first half of our class. And at this point, I'd love to hand over the reins to my colleague.
Thank you.
Terrific.
And we might there are a couple of questions up that, and Jeff, it's up to you if you want to take those right now.
Let's take the couple quick questions if we can, and then I'll pick up and do a little bit more of the sort of the history and philosophy of some of this as well. So I know Doug, Marge, and Russell, why don't you jump in?
what the thought that keeps echoing in my mind is that maybe at the point at which this was written, it wasn't so much that this was seen as an imposition of foreign values on the people of the Jewish people living in the land. Wasn't so much an imposition of the Syrian king pushing Greek values, but the all too willing acceptance of Greek values among the Jewish population at that time. And so this was sort of their way of celebrating the fact that the Hellenistic influences were thrown off in some fashion.
I'm going to talk about
the larger context is that the Jews were all too willing to take up the Hellenistic values of the Greeks.
That's a great point. I'm actually going to talk about that because some of the challenge of the Hanukkah story is the relationship of Judaism, Jewish thinking and Greek thinking, and it's much more nuanced and complicated than we might even think already. So that is part of that. But there's actually an even greater acceptance of Greek thinking than you might think. So I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So thank you. And Russell.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I may, be your hired warm-up act in this, Rabbi Mitelman, but it seems to me that the description of why it is a miracle is that we finally come down to why it is a miracle is the only one of those explanations that is not scientifically possible. And it seems that it also, in my mind, it relates to the dispute over whether or not we have an increasing amount of light or decreasing, even though the numerology doesn't line up. And I personally abhor numerology in the first place. The lighting of the candles to me reminds me of the creation of the world, which begins with the words, "Let there be light." And each day brings a new illumination, a new creation, a new invention, culminating in or deteriorating to us as humans. And it has always impressed me that the increasing amount of light is not only reiterating creation, but it is becoming more and more miraculous. To me, dwindling light, there's nothing miraculous about light. But I know that you're going to talk to us about science, and it seems to me the fact that this is reminding us, whether it is of the sacrifices of the animals or whether it's reminding us of the creation of light, that these are things that are not scientifically possible.
And so that's a great point. So thank you. And I think one of the things that we're going to unpack a little bit is what is scientific and what is a story. And there's an author who's actually passed away recently, a guy named Michael Dowd, who was a reverend who wrote a book called "Thank God for Evolution," and he talks about day language versus night language, of day language being sort of the scientific analysis and the night language being the stories that you tell over the campfire. And they tell different stories and they have different purposes here. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to unpack a little bit of this question of, does the story need to be scientifically accurate? And I think the answer is no, but as you're talking about, this is one of my favorite little sort of tidbits of trivia about Hanukkah that it's not always exactly true, but Russell, as you're bringing this up, this is made me think of this, that the seventh night of Hanukkah almost always is the darkest night of the year. It's not the shortest night of the year. The shortest night of the year is the winter solstice. But the darkest night, why is the seventh night of Hanukkah the darkest night of the year outside? Anyone know what the calendar is?
Yeah, the moon is the smallest, right? It's got
right. That's the new moon. the-
I looked up the dates, and the last night of Hanukkah is the 14th, and the new moon is the 12th.
so, right, so it's around
the eighth night would have coincided.
right. The eighth night, the last night of Hanukkah. It depends on like when exactly the new moon is. But it's usually the sixth or seventh night. Usually it's the seventh night is the closest to when the new moon exists, which is, as Steve was saying, that's when the moon is there's no moon. You don't the moon exists, but you don't actually see it there. So Russell, that's an idea of it reaching the level of 7 days of creation with an extra day to be able to bring in, to add to an extra miracle here as well. Now, when the rabbis were coming up with the idea of should Hanukkah be on the 25th day of Kislev, that's going to match with when the lunar solar calendar is going to be, like, no, of course not. That was not where, it was not an on purpose idea, but to be able to say the seventh day of Hanukkah is the darkest night of the year each year. Usually it's one of the closest, at least depends on exactly when Hanukkah is, but it's usually one of the darkest nights of the year. That's a story that we can then tell. So when we're hearing the story and the nace, as Rabbi Blake was talking about, of the story of the miracle, that is an ex post facto story. That's something that's told later on. Because as Rabbi Blake was saying, there actually is a tremendous amount of archaeological and literary evidence of the Maccabean revolt. And there are actually, and Doug and Marge, this comes back to what you're actually referencing. There is a tremendous amount of archaeological evidence and literary evidence. The earliest stories that we have about the Maccabean revolts are two books that are not accepted in Jewish canon, but they are accepted in some Protestant and Catholic and Eastern Orthodox texts, called First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, which, by the way, are different than, for example, in the Hebrew Bible, like First Kings and Second Kings, it tells the story, and then it continues the story. First Samuel tells the story, and then continues the story. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees are two different ways of telling the same story. It's not one and then the other, but they were written only about maybe 20, 30 years after the Maccabean revolt. They're pretty close afterwards. And they are stories that talk about how horrible and awful the Greeks were and how they desecrated the temple, and we need to overthrow the puppet masters here. And boy, Hellenism is awful. And guess what language Second Maccabees was written in?
Greek, probably.
Greek. Right. It was not. First Maccabees, by the way, was written in Hebrew, but the only extant version was written in Greek. But Second Maccabees was written in Greek. So much of Greek thinking influenced Judaism in ways that we don't even think about. And one of the analogies that I like to explore is the role that almost like Reform Judaism, where where did Reform Judaism start? Reform Judaism started in Germany in the 1800s as part of Enlightenment thinking. And so Reform Judaism was an integration of what was then German thinking, Enlightenment thinking, that influenced Judaism and influences us in ways that we're not even aware of right now, which then got exported into America and really took root in America. So Western thought and Western Enlightenment thought started in France and Germany in the 1800s, really took root in America, and that's why Reform Judaism flourished here. Greek thinking really influenced all of the Mediterranean world, and then the Roman Empire was the one that's where it really took hold and took root. So Greek thinking and Roman thinking are deeply influenced in Jewish thought and Jewish thinking in a lot of different ways. So, for example, the Passover Seder was in many ways based off of a Greco-Roman symposium with lots of questions here. If you think about the way that we were talking about of debates and arguments, if you think about, well, that's Socrates of being able to ask questions and pushing back and forth. If you look at so much of Greek of Talmudic thinking, of arguing, of how do we know this? Min ayin. There are logical descriptions that come up of how Jewish argument comes into existence. That's all Greek thinking. So when we're thinking about this idea of the Jews versus the Greeks, that's a much more of an oversimplification. And it's even an oversimplification of saying Jews versus Jews. Everybody in the Eastern Mediterranean had some element of Hellenistic thinking, which then links to this question of miracles, because a lot of Greek thinking was influenced, and then later, as we're thinking about this in terms of Western thought, of is a miracle something that is supernatural? So I'm going to open this up. I'm curious as to hear about this. When you hear the word miracle, does that necessarily need to be supernatural? Yeah, Kathy. Oh, you're muted. Yeah, yes, your hand raised, but yep.
Me. Okay. I'm thinking it's a miracle. Is it a miracle because you say it's a miracle and because you might be able to convince somebody else it's a miracle? In the case of, the oil and the candles, as an example, was it considered a miracle in real time? Was it memorialized in real time, or was it a story with a purpose later on because the Jewish people really needed it?
Right, and that's so trying to come up for a scientific explanation of a miracle kind of misses the point in a lot of ways. That's right. That as Rabbi Blake was saying, this story of the oil and the miracle is a later story. And by the way, it impacts us today. It's part of our shared story, and so it's trying to push it into a box. It's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Aaron, now you've got your hand.
I mean, in the very literal sense, I used to believe that was the definition of a miracle, that it was a divine intervention, and therefore I didn't believe in them. And then, through studying here and with Rabbi Blake and the other clergy at WRT, I now don't think that that's the definition at all. And I think that there are a lot of examples of miracles in our daily life that really have more to do with humans and their capacity to be good than any divine intervention.
Right. The word thank you. And we use the word miracle so often. If we think of like the miracle of the oil, which happened one time, or the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea, or for Christians, you think about like the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus, right? These are one-time things. And yet we talk about, if you have children, they talk about the miracle of birth. Is there something, if you define it, less miraculous than birth, right? That's in some ways, it happens thousands, if not millions of times a day. And yet it is a miracle, right? It is something that is unbelievable when we think about what a miracle is. Or if we think about just in the last couple of years of the COVID vaccine, people talked about that of a miraculous way of being able to come up with these vaccines, and thank God for the vaccines. And was there anything sort of less miraculous in terms of miracles, of like supernatural, than lots of doctors and nurses being able to come up with vaccines? So we can talk about and yet it's miraculous because of how it impacts us. So the idea of miracle does not necessarily have to be supernatural. Yeah, Doug and Marge.
Well, there's miraculous as an adjective, and then there's miraculous as in not possible by any means that we now know. I mean, if it took a butane lighter into the deep darkest areas of the Amazon and showed a native tribe how if you flick this you made fire, they would consider that a miracle. But that's based on just what a wonderful thing, and not understanding what's behind it. On the other hand, it seems to me that resurrection of the dead is a different kind of miracle.
Right. So trying to tease out of is something supernatural, because so put it this way, basically anything that happens supernatural by definition is miraculous, but not everything that is miraculous is something that is supernatural, right? That's so we conflate those in a lot of ways. Yeah, Aaron, go ahead.
I guess to Doug's point, and also something that I think is relevant when you're talking about the Greeks and the Jews, I think when you talk about miracles or the way that supernatural things were used in the past, they were used to explain things that they didn't yet have the science to understand. So Greek mythology was something that was used to explain all of these natural things that we now have the understanding of how they occurred to people who didn't have the understanding, to make sense of a world they didn't understand. I'm kind of the belief, therefore, that things we don't understand now will be explained one day, just like creation was explained, and then 6,000 years ago, no one knew.
So that brings up a point, and we may even talk about this in our mini course a little bit here. I'm always a little bit hesitant to be able to say science will explain X or Y or Z. Because both science and religion sometimes, instead of explaining it away. So for example, the laws of kashrut, the laws of keeping kosher, which are critical for in the story of Hanukkah, the laws of kashrut they may have had some sort of a health element there, but if the only reason that people should keep kosher is because, well, they didn't know about trichinosis, that eliminates any ritual reason for keeping kosher. If we talk about Hanukkah and the importance of circumcision, and if they talk about if the only reason of circumcision is a medical reason, that eliminates the ritual reason of being able to do that. So I'm always a little bit hesitant to be able to say science is going to explain everything, because it may or it may not, and yet is that still going to be the motivating reason? And I think we're always, both science and religion are striving for an explanation in some way, and yet we need to be able to recognize what is the purpose of the explanation. And so is it trying to be able to say that the rabbis, by the way, are not trying to scientifically explain the miracle? That's not the goal, or any of the miracles that are described in the Torah. Trying to explain the science of the miracle, in my mind, misses the science and it misses the religion. Because the purpose of the story is not to be able to give some sort of legitimate scientific explanation. It is there to be able to create a ritual and religious and communal explanation rather than a scientific explanation. As what we would call like the day language versus the night language. If you were to tell a story around as a campfire and tell a wonderful story, people are not going to say, well, who is that person's parents? What town do they come from? Like, no, that's not the point of the story. You're trying to be able to give a lesson, if that makes sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah, Ruth, looks like you have your hand. Yeah.
Well, what I'm wondering is, does the scientific explanation then take away from the ritual use of it, or the religious? When you get an explanation, does that take away from the religious? So I will ask this, like as Russell, for example, put in his in the chat, and if any of you are parents or have something that happened that was incredible, like Russell said, I've got 3 miracles, right? If you were to discover, as I'm sure you all did, if you had children, that there was a scientific process by which you had children, and if I were to say that is not a supernatural element, that's not going to change any way that you feel about your children. You're not going to stop calling your children a miracle, right? Understanding the science of how children are born, or how vaccines get developed, or discovering new life on other planets. If the James Webb Telescope, if we discover these new things scientifically, we are still going to use the word nace or miracle here. So in my mind, trying to
trying to come up with a scientific explanation, I think can be interesting, but it is still going to be an impact. It's still going to have a story to be able to tell us in the same way that any children are miracles, right? And there's and the development of so much technology, so many sciences. I don't remember who had said, like, if we were to bring in some sort of technology to a community that has never seen this, it might have been Doug who had said that, if we bring some technology to a community that we never understood, or if we, or yeah, what were you gonna say, Jonathan?
No, I was going to say that, I'm reminded of I think, profound wisdom of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who taught that the religious experience is, first of all, subjective in that it emerges from the subjective experience of the person. And that it is, and I think he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said basically the root of religious experience, the root of the religious experience is awe, right? The human capacity for awe or wonder is actually a subjective evaluation, and that there are two different ways, for lack of a better way of putting it, that we can live our lives. We can live our lives in a secular frame where we say, well, everything can be explained, and therefore I have no need for religion. Or we can say, I choose to live in a world where my experience of the world is one of awe and wonder. And I hold the universe in awe. And I view everything as miraculous, therefore. And that really directs my life in a very different direction. Like, the way I'm going to live, if I bring that orientation to life, is going to be fundamentally different from somebody who says, well, yeah, I don't really, there's nothing special about love. It's just neurochemistry. It's like, well, yeah, but wouldn't you rather live in a world where you can love and be loved?
And there's, in the Reform movement, in the prayer book, in the morning, there's a section, traditionally it's called the Birchot HaShachar, the morning blessings, but Mishkan Tefillah is called the Nisim B'chol Yom, the miracles of the everyday, which is a wonderful contradiction, because a miracle, we think of, when we talk about a miracle, like it's a one time in a ever, right? But the Nisim B'chol Yom, the miracles of the everyday, there's a miracle that happens every day, and the miracles are totally natural things of the sun coming up, being able to tell between night and day, having strength. These are things which are totally natural, and yet we can view them as a miracle. There's, again, coming back to the Passover story, my favorite word in the whole Passover Haggadah is everyone should see Ke'ilu. Everyone should see as if they themselves went forth from Egypt, as if they did this. Did we literally go out of Egypt? I have no idea. Like, historically, right? But if we view ourselves Ke'ilu, as if we went forth from Egypt, well, that then impacts how we live in this world. I mean, Judith, and then Barbara, and then Kathy.
Yeah, just to me, the human being as a human is a miracle. When you think of the functioning of everything, the eye, the way the eye functions, the retina, you can go into any detail within the human body and realize and think about how could this happen? And that brings me to the divine. The other thing that I think that is important or interesting is the idea of oneness, of one being at one with another being, with a tree, with the whole philosophy of oneness is an extraordinary idea, and I like thinking about that because it just, to me, there's a divineness to that, but it's also, it functions as a relationship to people, to humans, to the miracle of a tree or a flower. So that's another aspect of the miracle of oneness.
Right, and thinking about how do we think about and talk about God? for me, I identify as a religious naturalist. My view of God does not have a supernatural element of this. And yet, seeing how the eye evolved through natural selection, that is a miracle. It is not supernatural in my mind, but it is miraculous in the same way that love is not supernatural, but it is miraculous. And all we can do is we can tell stories about this, and stories change our lives. What is the story that we are telling? There's a person, and I know Jonathan loves him as well. Thinker named Yuval Noah Harari, who's a really brilliant thinker. And he said, that's what makes humans unique, is that we can actually tell stories. And the stories then impact everything in our lives. And religion is a story. Nations are a story. Money is a story. Law is a story. These are all things that exist only because they exist in our minds, and as we've agreed that they are. I think we can think about this. Does an ant experience miracles? And I would argue no. That because it is a human experience to be able to see, and not just see, but talk about a miracle here. So ants can feel lots of pleasure and pain and have experiences, but only humans are able to talk about and share a story about a miraculous nature.
Which is, by the way, Noah Yuval Harari is so worried about AI. Because he actually believes that AI has or will rapidly develop the ability to tell stories of its own and to create new religion.
Yep.
Talks a lot. He's written a lot about it in the last year.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that.
If you can invent a religion, that kind of makes you a god.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's when people say a lot of questions are we playing God with kinds of technology? It's an increase of knowledge and power. And I think we talk about new technology, and if we define technology broadly, of that being a miracle, well, where are miracles here as well? So Barbara.
I'm curious. Isn't it incumbent upon us to tell our little ones, our younger ones, the story of both sides, and what possibly could have happened, and what did happen, and what the miracle, quote unquote? Because as a child, I remember this. I never heard anything other than the story of the oil.
Right.
And if you say to one of our younger ones, what is a miracle of Hanukkah, they'll say the story of the oil, without even considering what the Maccabees went through. And that's a real disservice.
Yeah.
You won't find a book for children written in this manner. It's a real disservice.
So that's you're bringing up a real challenge of basically every kind of education, which is at what point do kids need a little bit more nuance? Because we want them to also be able to understand what's going on, because the Hanukkah story, as with any kind of history or philosophy, we need to be able to present it in a way that is understandable, and also as they get older, as this is a lot of what people talk about, of age-appropriate education. And I think you're right, of being able to talk about multiple different stories. It's also hard because there's different perspectives and different ideas, and you don't want to necessarily confuse kids. But it often, by the way, becomes normal as adults engage in more text study and more Jewish stories. And wait a second, I didn't know that was the story that was told. I
really think this strikes at the heart of why I think that we fail to educate our children Jewishly, religiously, in ways that will effectively stave off them rejecting religion when they get older because it's irrational, right? So I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we tell our kids that the goal of a religious education or the goal of being Jewish is that you have to believe things that they will eventually come not to believe because they make no sense. And I would much rather have conversation with kids about, well, you could do this very conversation with kids of any age about what's a miracle. What's a miracle in your life, right? And what's the real miracle of Hanukkah? You know, here's the oil story, but here's also the story of people who asserted their right to be Jewish in a world that didn't want them to be Jewish, and that they actually prevailed. Like there are so many different conversations you can have with kids. One of my operating principles as a rabbi has always been never teach a child something that they will later have to unlearn.
Yep.
And if you're going to tell them about miracles, let them at least explore the idea. Don't make it the foundation stone of their religious identity that they have to, quote unquote, believe things that are scientifically impossible.
And I think it's also to not denigrate that as well, and to be able to say, and I say this with my kids when we look at the questions of the origins of the universe in Genesis, and it may have been Aaron who you had said earlier, of trying to say this was an understanding that they had at the time. And by the way, we engage in these texts, we take these texts seriously and we grapple with them. In my mind, this is not the literal story of what happened. And yet we engage with these texts in the same way that we look at any story. And it's a sacred story that binds us together. So how do we have both the, I think it is important to be able to say this is a story and this is the story without necessarily overpromising what it is.
I noticed Russell's comment in the chat, by the way, the fewer war stories we teach our kids, the better. I just want to say your discomfort is one that's really old in the Jewish tradition. The rabbis themselves did not like the Hanukkah story. I mean, the Hanukkah, that's one of several reasons, the other being the fact that the text is originally in Greek, but the Maccabees is not included in canonized Jewish text. And it's also informs, I think, the reason that the Haftarah for Hanukkah includes the famous line, not by might, not by power, but my spirit, saith the Lord, right? So there's a strong tradition in Judaism not to glorify war and the spoils of war, but rather to impute power to God. Similarly, in the Passover Haggadah, like the story is not of a violent slave rebellion, nor is the story about Moses's own ability to marshal power and set free the slaves of Egypt. The story is about miracles, actually. The story is like, look what God is capable of. God makes the possible, God makes the impossible possible. That's the story the rabbis wanted to tell. And as Barbara noted before, there was probably a self-preservationist instinct behind that too. It's like, you're not going to teach your kids stories of violent overthrow of the empire if you're living under a foreign empire.
I want to make sure, in a second, I want to get the last couple of comments, but I wanted to share a couple little pieces. One, we didn't even get to, I'm going to put in the chat, a wonderful article from the Atlantic from a writer named Alan Lightman, who wrote a great book called Einstein's Dreams. But he has a
great book.
Great book. He's written a couple of books, and you can Google him. He's done a lot of work as he calls himself a spiritual materialist. And this is an article in the Atlantic about miracles and multiverses. So I put that here. But this is what I often teach with my kids about miracles. This is from I'm going to share my screen here from a rabbi I really like, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who's written beautiful poetry. That actually his book was called "God Was in This Place and I Did Not Know," which is a verse that's in the Greek portion. But he says, Jewish tradition says that the splitting of the Red Sea was the greatest miracle ever performed. It was so extraordinary that on that day, even a common servant beheld more than all the miracles beheld by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel combined. And yet we have one midrash that mentions two Israelites, Reuben and Shimon, who had a different experience. Apparently, the bottom of the sea, though safe to walk on, was not completely dry, but a little muddy, like a beach at low tide. Reuben stepped into it and curled his lip. What is this muck? Shimon scowled. There's mud all over the place. This is just like the slime pits of Egypt, replied Reuben. What's the difference, complained Shimon. Mud here, mud there, it's all the same. And so it went for the two of them, grumbling all the way across the bottom of the sea. And because they never once looked up, they never understood why on the distant shore, everyone else was singing songs of praise. For Reuben and Shimon, the miracle never happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's and Kushner talks about this of the question in philosophy of if a tree falls in the forest, does it happen? Or these are questions of science. Like science is our attempt to be able to understand the world. The science is whatever it's going to be without our interference. That's how that's what science aims to be able to do. But miracles, if we don't experience in them and talk about them, they don't happen. And so that's how I tend to view and think about this question of, was the story of the miracle of the oil. In my mind, it's not a supernatural story. I think it is a story the rabbis told. They had a reason to be able to tell it, and they love telling the story. And as Jonathan was saying, it was the first time that actually that became an extra biblical text and an extra biblical holiday. And yet the story still resonates with us, and it still brings out questions for us to be able to explore.
Who was it that talked about non-overlapping? You know this.
Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould.
Magisterial, right?
Which has its own issues. I'm not a huge fan of that, to be honest.
The extractable point that I like, so that we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, is that science and religion are often attempting to answer very different questions.
Yep.
That they operate in different domains. I can see why you'd take issue with it.
Yep. And I think that where there is value is trying to use science to explain religion ends up being a disservice to both science and religion.
That's a point I can stand behind readily.
Yep. So I don't know what, John, I don't know whether there are a couple of hands.
We'll take a few hands and then we'll wrap for today. And we're just delighted to, this was really intended to be a conversation that gives us new ways of appreciating Hanukkah. And also introducing you to a wonderful teacher who's going to be with us this winter. I look forward to participating as often as my schedule will allow it for Rabbi Mitelman's winter course, which is called Judaism on the Vanguard of the Future. And then after we take the three hands that are up, Jeff, if you'll just say two more words about what we'll be covering this winter, I think that would be great. And then people will look for it in the bulletins that should be arriving at your homes in print and are on the website, as well as your weekly e-blast. So Kathy, Michelle, Aaron, in that order, and then Jeff, you get the final word.
All right.
Yeah, can you hear me? I think we should.
We do.
Okay, great. So I read that, there are four key ways of interpreting the Torah, and I assume any Jewish text. And even if we have a scientific or even existential personal ideology, is it our obligation to treat the miracles that we find in various texts as if they were true? And how do we discuss them in a world where everybody might not have the same predilection to acknowledging that they might be true miracles?
So I like to think of the text and the story as poetry. And I have to plug my cousin's book, my cousin Matthew Zapruder, who, yes, is the grandson of Abraham Zapruder, but Matthew was actually the editor of the New York Times poetry section. He wrote a book called Why Poetry, and it's a book in prose, but it's a book of why poetry, and I think it's a very apt analogy of looking at the text. So if you look at a poem, what Matthew says is you've got to start with the words in front of you. Some people think poetry can be whatever you want it to be. And Matthew says, No, that's actually not true, right? If you were to say, and you can talk about this about a lot of different books, if you were to say that Moby Dick is actually about the intricacies of the Bolshevik overthrow of the Tsarist regime, you're wrong, right? That's like, you're wrong. If it's a Moby Dick, like, you can have a lot of interpretations, but you've got to say, what does the text in front of you have to say? So I think there is an obligation to start with what the text says. You don't necessarily have to agree with it. You don't necessarily have to take it as quote unquote literal or scientific, but you do have to start with the text as what it says and what it was understood in its time. That's where you've got to start. It's not where you end, but I do think it is important to be able to say, this is the text that we're looking at, and this is how we're going to explore it.
Right.
Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, hi. So I didn't know it was unusual. Every year at Hanukkah, my father would read us a story that in fact, spoke to the Maccabean revolt, and was the history. Although now I'm thinking it might not have been a children's book, and there were a lot fewer at the time, children's little kids' books at the time. When my kid was young, age appropriate, I went looking for a Hanukkah storybook, and I found lots of cutesy, absolutely stupid books about, Grandma and the Dancing Latkes and whatever. I finally found one book, which I think is now out of print, that was a picture book that's told the Hanukkah story in any way, form that to me was about the Hanukkah story. It was called Judah Who Just Said No. So if you have it or if it's in the library, use it. But I don't see any reason you can't teach both.
I think that's accurate. And there's also I think even more complicated than Hanukkah is Purim. Purim is a story that if you actually read the book of Esther, it is not, the story of Esther and the Purim story is R, if not X rated. And I also remember growing up on Purim of singing a song. You may have remembered, it's been edited since then, that went, oh, once there was a wicked man, and Haman was his name, sir. He would have murdered all the Jews where they were not. And I'm like, now in retrospect, I'm like, whoa, that's what we're singing. So there is value in finding the right story to be able to have the right audience at the right time in the right place. And I think it is, as kids get older, to be able to know what was written, why, and how, whatever that text is in Judaism. Yeah, Erin.
I just wanted, Rabbi Mitelman, I think you're the only one on this call who doesn't know I'm actually a scientist. And so,
okay.
but I wanted to thank you for what you're doing, because I'm a reform scientist now. And I was one of those people who I think 4 years ago would have absolutely refused to join any of these things, these classes. And I totally agree with everything you're saying. I mean, I'm raising my children now. They go to synagogue every Saturday. They go to Hebrew school. They're going to be B'nai Mitzvah. And we talk about these things. We talk about, Mommy, did the Exodus from Egypt actually happen? And if not, why do we celebrate it? And to Rabbi Blake's credit, Cantor Rodnitsky came to my Passover Seder and answered that question for my daughter. So I do think that these days we are doing a better job institutionally and at home of explaining to children that you can do both, and they get the science part from me and they get the God part from everyone else. And I just really appreciate, my life is better today than it was before, and that's because Rabbi Blake and his team and people like you have taught me how to meet the two together. And I just wanted to say thank you.
I'm thrilled, and I know that I'm seeing Rabbi Blake smile broadly here as well. So,
well, he knows this.
Yeah, but still, if you want to talk what constitutes, playing back on what the Talmud teaches us about the Maccabees, what constitutes a real victory for the Jewish people, there it is, my friends.
Yep.
Jeff, will you say one word about Judaism on the Vanguard of the Future, and then I'm going to close the Zoom so I can go lay to rest and share very loving and affectionate words about our dear member Phyllis Rand, Zichrona livracha. Some of you may remember Phyllis. She was among the most devoted adult ed learners at WRT since she joined in 1959. So she's a member of our founding generation, lived a life of 97 years, raised her family at the temple, and it's a sacred, if sad, privilege to be part of remembering her today. But she would have loved this class. She suffered from a cognitive decline over the last 4 years and hasn't participated in adult ed since before COVID. But many of you may have taken classes with Phyllis. She was always the one with the most incisive comment. So Zichrona livracha, may her memory be a blessing. Jeff, share a word about what's starting in January, and then I'll sign us off.
Sure. So thank you for having me here this morning. I'm excited to be learning with you all in a few weeks. So we are going to be looking at some of the big technological questions that we're grappling with in our world and how they are in conversation with Jewish texts and Jewish thought. So a couple of these ideas. One is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really, in my mind, coming to this core of the question of what does it mean to be human? We tend to really celebrate of what makes humans unique. And we've always said one of the things that makes us unique is our intelligence. Well, is artificial intelligence making us less valuable? Where do we come in as human value and human values? So we're going to be in conversation and looking at texts and ideas there. Another one that I've just started teaching about is, are we still special if we're not alone? The James Webb Telescope and a lot of the work, we've been seeing a lot of this in the last couple of weeks of finding, let's say, unidentified objects, and there is some science that is looking at that. I don't think actually we've been visited by aliens, but I think it is not. I think it's going to be a question of when we are going to discover life on other planets. I don't think we're going to discover intelligent life on other planets, but I think we're going to discover life on other planets. What is that going to mean about our relationship of our uniqueness as on the earth? And does it matter if human life is unique? Does that make us, as we discover new galaxies, what is that going to mean about, are we alone? Does that matter? We're going to look at questions of CRISPR-Cas9 technology and technology. What does that mean about finding out, is that ethical to be able to find out some of the genetic information that we're finding? Can we edit that? And while Judaism and the rabbis had no idea about the about the James Webb Telescope or about CRISPR-Cas9 technology, they did come with these questions of what makes humans unique? Are Jews unique? How do we relate to the wider world? What is our responsibility with new technology and new power? That's what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. So I'm really excited to be exploring some of these questions.
That will begin January 5th. You'll be getting the full dates through Natalie's memos and through the bulletin and through the weekly e-blast, or it's all on the website, so you can just look for it there. Talmud class resumes next Thursday, the 7th, which is also the first night of Hanukkah. So I'll be able to wish you a happy Hanukkah then. And concludes for the fall semester on the 14th. And then we're going to have our winter term of Judaism on the Vanguard of the Future with Rabbi Mitelman, followed by Introduction to Rambam, that is Maimonides, with Rabbi Jan Katsu in the late winter. And then Talmud will resume again on the first day of spring in March with me. And Cantor Kleinman may be joining as we get ready for Pesach. And God willing, can resume our originally intended course of study, which is the Gemara on the Jewish holidays. So wishing everybody a safe and happy day. And please come tonight. Liel Leibowitz talking about the Talmud at WRT. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Kol hakavod, rabbis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Judy.
you.
Bye, guys.